The history books describe the Cold War as a period of tension that never boiled over. That phrase, never boiled over, gets repeated so often that it starts to feel like a fact rather than a near miracle. But when you pull the documents, when you go through the declassified cables and the buried after-action reports and the testimonies of men who spent decades keeping their mouths shut under security clearance obligations, what emerges is something different. What emerges is the portrait of a world that came within hours, sometimes within minutes, sometimes within the margin of a single misread radar signal, of ending itself. The Cold War was not a standoff. It was a sequence of near collapses held together by systems that were designed, from the very beginning, to operate without asking permission. What follows is the story of those systems, not the diplomats, not the summits, the machinery underneath. In the years immediately following the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves in possession of something that no civilization had ever held before: the genuine technical capacity to end organized human life on Earth. That was not rhetoric. It was arithmetic. The weapons existed, the delivery systems were being built, the command structures were being assembled, and on both sides, the people responsible for managing these capabilities understood, in a very quiet and very practical way, that the greatest threat was not the enemy's intention to use them. The greatest threat was the possibility that the systems surrounding them would make that decision on their own. The first safeguard worth understanding was not a weapon or a bunker or a hotline. It was a concept. It was called mutual assured destruction, and it was built not on the idea that neither side would want to fire first, but on the idea that neither side could afford to. The logic was circular, and it was intentional. If launching a first strike guaranteed your own annihilation, then the rational actor would not launch. But the system only worked if both sides believed the other was capable of absorbing a first strike and still retaliating with enough force to guarantee that annihilation. Which meant both sides had to spend enormous resources not on the ability to win a nuclear war, but on the ability to survive one long enough to fire back. The entire architecture of the Cold War's deterrent structure was built around the question of what happens after the first bomb falls. The safeguards were the answer, and the answer, in most cases, was more bombs. This is where the second safeguard comes in. In the early 1950s, American planners recognized a fundamental vulnerability in their nuclear deterrent. If the Soviet Union launched a surprise attack and destroyed American bombers on the ground before they could take off, there would be nothing left to retaliate with. The deterrent would collapse the moment it was tested. The solution was an airborne alert program. Bombers carrying live nuclear weapons would fly continuous patrols, staying in the air at all times, so that even a perfectly executed first strike could not eliminate the American retaliatory capability. The Strategic Air Command implemented this in a program that would eventually be known under various classified designations, and at its peak, there were nuclear-armed B-52s in the air around the clock, every day, every week, for years. The logic was airtight. The execution was something else entirely, because keeping nuclear-armed aircraft in the air continuously meant those aircraft were going to crash, and they did. On January 17, 1966, a B-52 collided with a KC-135 tanker aircraft during a refueling operation over the coast of Spain near the town of Palomares. 4 hydrogen bombs fell onto Spanish territory. 3 of them landed on land. 1 of them fell into the Mediterranean Sea and was not recovered for nearly 3 months. The conventional explosives in 2 of the land-based bombs detonated on impact, scattering plutonium across several square kilometers of Spanish farmland. The United States government spent weeks downplaying the incident to the Spanish public, to the international press, and to its own citizens. The radioactive contamination was real. The cleanup was incomplete, and the program that produced the accident continued. Because the alternative, grounding the bombers, was considered more dangerous than the crashes. That particular calculus, that the risk of the safeguard was preferable to the risk of being without it, runs through the entire history of Cold War systems. It explains decisions that look, from the outside, like institutional madness. And in a sense they were. But they were a very organized, very deliberate kind of madness, managed by bureaucracies that had concluded there was no safe option, only options with different failure modes. The third safeguard was the distant early warning line, a network of radar stations stretched across the Arctic from Alaska to Greenland to Iceland. The DW line was designed to give the United States roughly 15 to 30 minutes of warning before Soviet bombers reached North American airspace. 15 minutes. That was the window. In 15 minutes, the President of the United States, or whoever was reachable, had to make a decision about whether to scramble the retaliatory force. The system was built in the mid-1950s, and it was impressive engineering for its time. It was also almost immediately compromised by its own sensitivity. Radar systems designed to detect incoming Soviet bombers had a consistent and terrifying tendency to detect other things instead. Flocks of geese, the moon rising over the horizon, atmospheric interference. In 1960, the ballistic missile early warning system at Thule Air Base in Greenland generated an alarm indicating that a massive Soviet missile strike was underway. The alert went up through the chain of command. Officers began the process of preparing a response. The signal indicated a 99.9% probability of attack. What the radar had actually detected was the moon. The curvature of the Earth had brought the lunar surface into the radar's field of view at a particular angle, and the system had interpreted it as hundreds of incoming ballistic missiles. The attack was not real. The response protocols that were initiated were real. The margin between a procedure being started and a procedure being completed was, in that moment, the thing standing between continuity and catastrophe. The fourth safeguard was the nuclear command authority structure itself, the chain of custody that determined who could authorize the use of nuclear weapons and under what circumstances. In the United States, the official doctrine was clear. The president was the sole authority over nuclear release. But the practical reality of the Cold War immediately complicated that doctrine. The president might be dead. The communication lines might be severed. The time available might be too short for any human being to be consulted at all. So the system built in what planners called pre-delegation. Under certain conditions defined by criteria that were themselves classified, the authority to use nuclear weapons could pass downward through the chain of command without the explicit approval of the president. The exact boundaries of pre-delegation were never fully disclosed to the public, and in many cases were not fully disclosed to Congress. What declassified documents reveal is that at various points during the Cold War, theater commanders, the officers responsible for specific geographic regions, had access to release authority under conditions that were broad enough to include their own judgment about whether an attack was imminent. The system was designed to prevent a decapitation strike from leaving the United States unable to respond. What it also created was a structure in which nuclear weapons could, under the right sequence of events, be authorized by someone several levels below the president, based on that person's assessment of a situation that might itself be the product of a malfunctioning radar, a miscommunicated alert, or a simple clerical error. The fifth safeguard was the nuclear football. The leather-bound briefcase that travels with the President of the United States, carried by a military aide, containing the authentication codes and communication equipment necessary for the President to authorize a nuclear strike from anywhere in the world. The football became a symbol of presidential authority during the Cold War, photographed at summits and on Air Force One, presented to the public as evidence that control was always in the right hands. What the football actually represented was the acknowledgement that the president might need to authorize a nuclear strike from a location where no other communication infrastructure existed. It was a portable command terminal for the end of the world. The codes inside it were changed regularly, the procedures attached to it were rehearsed, and the system worked exactly as designed during every rehearsal. The question that nobody could fully answer was whether it would work during an actual event, when the president might be injured or separated from the aide, or in a location where even the football's communication systems could not reach the necessary satellites. The football was a safeguard against the loss of command authority. It was also evidence that loss of command authority was considered a realistic possibility. The sixth safeguard was the Soviet equivalent, and it was considerably more alarming. The Soviet nuclear command system operated under different doctrinal assumptions than the American one. Soviet planners were acutely aware that a first strike by the United States might target Soviet leadership specifically, eliminating the people who could authorize retaliation before they had the chance to do so. The solution they eventually developed, work on which began in the 1970s and which became operational in the 1980s, was a system known internally as perimeter, and known in the West by the name that American analysts gave it after learning of its existence: dead hand. Perimeter was designed to detect the indicators of a nuclear attack on Soviet territory through a network of seismic sensors, radiation detectors, and pressure gauges. If those sensors registered what the system interpreted as a nuclear strike, and if communication with Soviet leadership had been severed, Perimeter would automatically transmit launch commands to Soviet nuclear forces without requiring any human authorization. The system could, under the right conditions, launch a retaliatory strike without a single human being making the decision to do so. Soviet planners considered this a safeguard. They were not wrong. If the leadership was dead and the communication networks were destroyed, Perimeter ensured that retaliation would still occur, which preserved the deterrent. What it also created was a situation in which nuclear war could be initiated by a machine that was responding to sensor data that might be incorrect, in a scenario in which there was no living person with the authority to countermand the order. The seventh safeguard was the hotline between Washington and Moscow, established in 1963 following the Cuban Missile Crisis. The hotline is almost universally described in popular accounts as a red telephone. It was never a telephone. In its original form, it was a teletype machine, transmitting text messages rather than voice, because the possibility of miscommunication or misinterpretation over a voice line was considered too high when the messages being transmitted concerned the possible use of nuclear weapons. The hotline was established specifically because the Cuban Missile Crisis had demonstrated how dangerously slow the existing communication channels were. During the crisis, messages between Kennedy and Khrushchev were being transmitted through commercial telegraph services, a process that took hours. The hotline was designed to reduce that lag to minutes. It was also designed to transmit routine test messages every hour so that both sides could verify the line was operational. The American side traditionally sent passages from literary texts. The Soviet side sent meteorological reports. Neither side communicated anything substantive through the hotline for most of its existence. It was a safeguard against communication failure that was itself a form of communication, a continuous signal that both sides were still present, still monitoring, still capable of being reached. The significance of the hourly test message was not its content. It was the silence that would follow if it stopped arriving. The eighth safeguard was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed in 1968, which attempted to formalize the boundary between states that possessed nuclear weapons and states that did not. The treaty was a safeguard against the expansion of the nuclear club, based on the recognition that every additional state with nuclear weapons increased the number of potential miscalculations, accidents, and unauthorized launches. The treaty was also, from the moment of its signing, a demonstration of its own limits. India did not sign it, and later tested a nuclear device. Pakistan followed. Israel maintained what became known as deliberate ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying possession of nuclear weapons while making no serious effort to disguise the capability. The treaty created a legal architecture around a reality it could not fully contain. It was a safeguard that worked for the states that accepted it and was irrelevant to the states that did not. The ninth safeguard was the network of underground command bunkers built by both superpowers to protect their leadership in the event of a nuclear attack. In the United States, the most famous of these was the facility beneath Raven Rock Mountain in Pennsylvania, known as Site R, which served as an alternate command facility for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia concealed a congressional relocation facility beneath its grounds for nearly 30 years, its existence kept secret from virtually all of the people who used the resort above it. The Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado was hollowed out of solid granite and equipped with enormous steel springs to absorb the shock of a nearby nuclear detonation. The Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center in Virginia served as the relocation site for senior civilian officials. Each of these facilities was built around the same fundamental premise, that nuclear war would not be instantaneous, that there would be a period of survival during which government could continue to function, and that the continuation of government was worth the enormous expense of building cities underground. The premise was not wrong exactly, but it was optimistic. The bunkers were designed to protect their occupants from blast and radiation. They were not designed to manage a world in which the agricultural systems, the water supply networks, and the distribution infrastructure of North America had been destroyed. The people in the bunkers would survive the bombs. What they would emerge to govern was a question the planners did not fully answer. The Soviet equivalent was considerably more extensive. The Soviets built a network of underground facilities on a scale that dwarfed the American program. The complex beneath Moscow alone was reported to include hundreds of kilometers of tunnels connecting multiple command nodes, leadership residences, and military headquarters. The scale of the Soviet underground infrastructure suggested a planning assumption that nuclear war was not only survivable, but manageable, that the machinery of the Soviet state could continue to function beneath the rubble of its cities. Whether that assumption was ever tested remains unknown. What is known is that the scale of the construction, sustained over decades and at extraordinary cost, reflected an institutional conviction that preparing for nuclear war was not merely prudent but necessary. The 10th safeguard was something considerably less visible than bunkers or hotlines. It was the system of coded authentication that governed the actual physical use of nuclear weapons at the field level. In the early years of the Cold War, the nuclear weapons deployed with American forces were controlled through a system that was, by modern standards, almost unbelievably permissive. The bombs themselves had very limited mechanical interlocks. The codes required to arm them were, in some cases, set at values that were known to field commanders without requiring any authorization from higher authority. A 2004 study by the nuclear historian Stephen Aftergood, drawing on declassified documents, revealed that during the 1960s, the permissive action links, the coded switches designed to prevent unauthorized use of nuclear weapons, were set to a combination that was all zeros across the board on Minuteman missiles, in order to satisfy commanders who were concerned that more complex authentication procedures might prevent timely use of the weapons during an actual crisis. The safeguard existed. The safeguard had been deliberately neutralized in the interest of operational readiness. This was not an accident or a failure of the system. It was a decision made by people who had concluded that the risk of being unable to fire the weapons quickly enough outweighed the risk of unauthorized use. The 11th safeguard was the Incidents at Sea Agreement, signed between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1972. By the late 1960s, the naval confrontations between American and Soviet vessels had reached a level of routine danger that was alarming to both sides. Soviet submarines shadowed American carrier groups. American destroyers shadowed Soviet surface ships. The interactions were close, frequent, and governed almost entirely by the judgment of individual commanders who were operating far from any possibility of political oversight. The agreement formalized a set of rules for how naval forces from both sides would behave when operating in proximity to each other. It did not prevent confrontation. It created a framework within which confrontation could occur without automatically escalating. The agreement was also, notably, a direct communication channel between military professionals from both sides, operating outside the normal diplomatic apparatus. Naval officers from the United States and the Soviet Union met annually to review incidents and discuss interpretations of the agreement. They were, in a very practical sense, managing the Cold War's most immediate danger zone through direct professional contact, while their governments maintained the official posture that such cooperation was ideologically impossible. The 12th Safeguard was one of the most technically sophisticated and least publicly understood systems of the entire Cold War period. It was the network of sensors, satellites, and monitoring stations that both superpowers maintained to detect nuclear detonations anywhere on Earth. The American version of this system, known by various designations over the years, was designed to provide immediate notification of any nuclear explosion, whether it was a Soviet first strike, an accidental detonation, or a test by a third party. The system included satellites equipped with optical and infrared sensors, ground-based seismic monitoring networks, and hydroacoustic sensors in the world's oceans designed to detect the underwater shockwaves produced by nuclear detonations. The Soviet equivalent was similarly comprehensive. The purpose of both systems was to remove ambiguity. If a nuclear weapon went off anywhere in the world, both superpowers would know immediately without relying on radar images or human intelligence that might be misinterpreted. But the systems were also capable of generating false positives. In 1979, an American satellite detected what appeared to be a small nuclear detonation in the South Atlantic near the Prince Edward Islands. The event, known as the Vela incident, was never conclusively explained. A technical review panel concluded that the satellite data was probably the result of a meteorite strike combined with instrument malfunction. Other analysts believed it was a nuclear test conducted by South Africa or Israel, or both in cooperation. The signal remained ambiguous. The system that was designed to remove ambiguity had produced one of the most enduring ambiguities of the Cold War. The 13th Safeguard was the arms control negotiation process itself. The long sequence of treaties and agreements that attempted to place quantitative limits on the nuclear arsenals of both superpowers. The SALT-I Agreement, signed in 1972, froze the number of strategic nuclear delivery vehicles at existing levels. SALT-II, negotiated through the late 1970s, attempted to establish more comprehensive limits, but was never ratified by the American Senate following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The START process that followed attempted to go further, reducing rather than merely capping the number of weapons. Each of these agreements was, in a structural sense, a safeguard. If both sides had fewer weapons, the consequences of a miscalculation would be somewhat less total. But each agreement was also surrounded by the same fundamental tension. Both sides were negotiating limits on weapons they were simultaneously developing. The agreements constrained certain categories of weapons while leaving others unrestricted. The Soviets built more ballistic missiles while agreeing to limits on their total throw weight. The Americans developed more accurate warheads while agreeing to limits on their total number. The safeguard of arms control was real, but it was also, always, partial. The negotiations were not about disarmament. They were about the management of an arms competition that neither side was willing to end. The 14th Safeguard was the command and control system that governed Soviet nuclear forces, and that became the subject of intense American intelligence interest throughout the Cold War. American analysts spent decades trying to understand exactly how the Soviet nuclear command system worked, who had authority to order a launch, under what conditions that authority could be delegated, and whether there were points of vulnerability that a decapitating first strike could exploit. The answers that emerged from declassified intelligence assessments were, in many ways, more alarming than the questions. The Soviet system appeared to be considerably more centralized than the American one in peacetime, with authority concentrated in the General Secretary and a small group of senior military officials. But in wartime, or in the period immediately preceding an expected American first strike, the system was designed to devolve authority rapidly downward, precisely to prevent the decapitation that American planners were theoretically targeting. The result was a system that was centralized enough to require political authorization in normal conditions, and decentralized enough to function without it when the political leadership was presumed dead. The zone between those two states, The ambiguous period when it was not yet clear whether an attack was underway or imminent was the most dangerous period of all. And it was precisely during that ambiguous period that most of the Cold War's near misses occurred. The 15th safeguard was the series of institutional procedures within both superpowers' militaries designed to prevent unauthorized or accidental nuclear use at the level of individual units and weapons operators. On the American side, these procedures included the two-man rule, which required that any action involving nuclear weapons be performed by at least two authorized personnel acting simultaneously, so that no single individual could unilaterally arm or detonate a weapon. The two-man rule was applied to the arming procedures, the launch sequences, and the physical handling of weapons. It was designed to prevent both unauthorized use and the possibility of a single psychologically unstable individual taking unilateral action. The rule was also, in practice, a safeguard against the scenario in which a commander ordered a launch that his subordinates believed to be unauthorized or insane. If two people had to agree to proceed, then a single officer acting on a delusional or criminal impulse could, in theory, be stopped by his partner refusing to cooperate. Whether that theory would hold under actual combat conditions when the order was coming from a superior officer in a situation of extreme stress was never tested. The two-man rule was a procedural safeguard. Its effectiveness depended on the assumption that the people operating within it would behave as designed. The 16th safeguard was the network of communication systems designed to ensure that the President of the United States could always reach American nuclear forces, regardless of the state of the civilian communication infrastructure. This included hardened communication lines, airborne command posts that could relay orders even if ground-based systems were destroyed, and a system of very low-frequency radio transmitters whose signals could penetrate seawater to reach submerged nuclear submarines. The submarine communication system was particularly important because ballistic missile submarines represented the most survivable leg of the nuclear triad. A submarine that had been at sea for weeks and was operating under strict communications, silence might receive its launch order through an antenna trailing behind it in the ocean, picking up a radio signal transmitted from a facility that was itself a high-priority target in any Soviet first strike. The communication chain between the president and a submarine carrying enough warheads to destroy every major city in Russia was, at certain points in the Cold War, a fragile sequence of relays through systems that had never been tested under actual wartime conditions. The safeguard existed. Its reliability under the conditions it was designed to survive was, by definition, untested. The 17th safeguard was the institutional culture of the Strategic Air Command under its founding commander General Curtis LeMay and his successors. LeMay built SAC into an organization defined by an almost obsessive focus on readiness, discipline, and the capacity to execute a nuclear strike at any moment. The culture he established was a safeguard in the sense that it produced an extremely reliable delivery system. It was also, in certain respects, a danger in itself. The culture that made SAC personnel exceptionally capable of executing a strike also made some of them exceptionally certain that a strike was the appropriate response to Soviet provocations. There is documented evidence that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, elements within the American military command structure were actively advocating for a first strike against Cuba and potentially against Soviet forces, in terms that went beyond what the civilian leadership had authorized or intended. The safeguard of institutional discipline was also the source of institutional pressure. The men who were most capable of using the weapons were, in some cases, the most eager to use them. The 18th safeguard was the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, established in 1961 as a dedicated bureaucratic institution within the American government responsible for managing the arms control process. The creation of a separate agency was itself a safeguard, an acknowledgement that the management of nuclear risk required dedicated institutional capacity that could not be left to the military or to the general foreign policy apparatus. The agency's existence represented the institutionalization of the idea that nuclear weapons required a different kind of management than conventional military capabilities. Over its existence, ACDA played a role in negotiating and implementing virtually every major arms control agreement of the Cold War. It was eventually folded into the State Department in 1999, after the Cold War had officially ended. The institutional capacity it represented was partially absorbed, partially dispersed, and partially lost. The safeguard of dedicated arms control bureaucracy was dismantled at roughly the same time that the circumstances which had made it necessary were supposedly resolved. The 19th safeguard was the system of crisis management protocols that both superpowers developed over the course of the Cold War. The procedural frameworks that governed how each side would behave during a period of acute tension. These protocols included pre-planned diplomatic communications, military postures that were designed to signal resolve without triggering automatic escalation, and back-channel communication arrangements that could function even when official diplomatic channels were frozen. The protocols were developed largely through experience, through the accumulation of crises that had been managed, sometimes barely, without resulting in nuclear exchange. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the most significant of these learning experiences, but it was not the only one. The Berlin Crises, the Korean War, the various confrontations in the Middle East that drew in superpower involvement, each of these produced institutional knowledge about how close the system could come to the edge before it needed to be pulled back. That knowledge was real. It was also always incomplete. Every crisis was different. Every crisis involved decision-makers who were operating under different constraints, with different information, in different institutional contexts. The protocols were a safeguard. They were not a guarantee. The 20th safeguard, and in many ways the most consequential, was something that operated almost entirely beneath the threshold of official policy. It was the network of individual human beings, on both sides, who at critical moments chose to behave in ways that the systems around them did not require and did not anticipate. These were not heroes in any conventional sense. They were, in most cases, people performing their assigned roles who encountered a situation in which the correct performance of that role would have led to catastrophe, and who chose to deviate from it. The most documented of these individuals was Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet lieutenant colonel who on September 26, 1983, was the duty officer at a Soviet nuclear early warning facility called Serpukhov 15. At 12 minutes past midnight, the facility's warning system indicated that the United States had launched a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. The system showed 1 missile incoming, then updated to 5. Petrov's protocols were clear. He was required to immediately notify his superiors, who would then initiate the Soviet response. Instead, Petrov hesitated. He reasoned, in the seconds available to him, that if the United States were launching a first strike, they would not send 5 missiles. They would send hundreds. The small number of incoming missiles was inconsistent with any rational first strike doctrine. He classified the alert as a system malfunction and did not transmit the notification. He was correct. The Soviet early warning satellite had misinterpreted the sunlight reflected off clouds above Montana as the exhaust plume of a launching Minuteman missile. The system malfunction was real. Petrov's deviation from protocol was the thing that prevented that malfunction from being transmitted upward into a command structure that might have responded to it with the assumption that it was real. Petrov was not celebrated for his decision. He was quietly reprimanded for improper record-keeping during the incident because in the stress of the moment, he had failed to log the incoming data correctly. He spent the following years in obscurity and was unknown to the general public until after the Soviet Union had dissolved. His case was illustrative not because it was unique, but because it was documented. The question it raises, the question that the entire architecture of Cold War safeguards ultimately cannot answer, is how many similar moments occurred that were not documented, that were not recognized as near misses until years later, or that were never recognized at all. There was another such moment, less well known than Petrov's, that occurred in 1983 as well. during a period that American intelligence analysts later described as one of the most dangerous of the entire Cold War. In November of that year, NATO conducted a command post exercise called Able Archer 83, which was designed to practice the procedures for transitioning from conventional to nuclear warfare. The exercise was routine in the context of annual NATO exercises. But the Soviet intelligence apparatus, under a leadership that had become genuinely convinced that the Reagan administration was planning a nuclear-first strike, interpreted Able Archer 83 as potentially a cover for an actual attack. Soviet nuclear forces in Europe were placed on heightened alert. Some Soviet aircraft were loaded with nuclear weapons, and their crews were brought to readiness. The Soviets were, for a brief period, genuinely uncertain whether they were watching a military exercise or the opening phase of a nuclear war. They were watching a military exercise, but the response they prepared was real. The alert status they reached was real. The margin between the exercise and the real thing was, in that moment, not the intentions of NATO commanders, which were entirely routine, but the assessment of Soviet intelligence analysts, which was not. The Able Archer crisis became known to American officials through intelligence reporting on Soviet reactions. When Reagan was briefed on how seriously the Soviets had taken the exercise, his reaction, documented in his diary, was one of genuine surprise. He had not understood how terrified the Soviet leadership had become of an American first strike, and he had not understood how that terror was translating into military postures that could, under the wrong circumstances, produce exactly the outcome everyone claimed to be preventing. This was, in a structural sense, the central failure of Cold War deterrence theory. The theory assumed rational actors with accurate information about each other's intentions. The reality was actors who were genuinely uncertain about each other's intentions, operating under institutional pressures that incentivized worst-case interpretation, in possession of weapons systems that were capable of acting faster than the human decision-making processes that were supposed to govern them. The entire system of safeguards reviewed in this account was built around the management of that gap between theory and reality. Every hotline, every bunker, every coded switch, every procedural protocol, every arms control treaty was an attempt to close a gap that could not be fully closed, because the gap was not technical. It was cognitive. It was the gap between the world as it actually was and the world as it appeared, through the lens of incomplete, distorted, and often deliberately manipulated information. The safeguards were genuine. The people who designed them were, in most cases, serious and capable professionals who understood the stakes. The systems they built reflected real learning from real experience, and the systems failed, partially and repeatedly, in ways that were either caught in time or never fully recognized. There is a set of incidents that did not receive significant public attention at the time and in many cases remained classified for decades, which collectively illustrate how thin the margin of safety actually was during the Cold War's most dangerous periods. In October 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flew off course during a routine air sampling mission and inadvertently entered Soviet airspace over the Chukotka Peninsula. Soviet interceptors scrambled to engage the aircraft. American fighters in Alaska were also scrambled, some of them carrying nuclear-armed Falcon missiles, because at the time no conventional interceptor missiles were readily available. For a period of time, there were nuclear-armed American fighter aircraft in Soviet airspace and Soviet interceptors attempting to engage them during the most acute nuclear crisis in the history of the Cold War. The incident was resolved without engagement, but only because the U-2 managed to navigate back to American airspace before the interceptors reached it. Kennedy, when informed of the incident, reportedly said that there is always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the word. That phrase captures something essential about the entire Cold War safeguard architecture. The systems were designed to manage rational actors with complete information operating within clearly defined protocols. The reality included aircraft that went off course, radar systems that saw moons as missiles, satellite sensors that saw sunlight as rocket exhaust, and human beings who, under extreme stress, did not always behave as their protocols required. The safeguards were designed for a war that was procedural and predictable. The war that was actually being managed was procedural and entirely unpredictable. In October 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, the United States raised its nuclear alert status to DEFCON 3, the highest peacetime level, in response to intelligence suggesting that the Soviet Union might intervene militarily in the Middle East conflict. The alert was ordered by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, acting without consulting the president, who was unavailable due to what was described as exhaustion during the Watergate crisis. The decision to raise the nuclear alert status of the United States, a decision with potential consequences of the most extreme kind, was made by a cabinet official who did not have formal authority to make it, acting without presidential awareness. In the middle of the night, the Soviets noticed the alert change immediately. Their own forces responded. The crisis was managed and de-escalated, but the sequence of events illustrated something that the safeguard architecture was not designed to address. The possibility that the human beings at the top of the command structure would not be functional, available, or legally empowered to make the decisions that the situation required. The American nuclear command structure had elaborate procedures for the incapacitation of the president. The 25th Amendment provided a constitutional mechanism for presidential succession, but the procedures assumed a clear and recognized incapacitation, not the ambiguous situation of a president who was technically functional but politically paralyzed by a crisis of a completely different kind. The safeguard of constitutional succession was designed for a world in which the threats were sequential. The reality of October 1973 was a world in which they were simultaneous. Throughout the Cold War, both superpowers maintained a practice that had no formal name, but was understood by everyone operating within the intelligence and military communities. It was the practice of managing information about near misses and accidents in ways that prevented them from becoming public knowledge. The Palomares incident in Spain was publicly minimized. The 1961 accident, in which a B-52 broke apart over North Carolina and dropped 2 hydrogen bombs, one of which came within a single safety switch of detonating, was not publicly acknowledged in its full detail for decades. The 1966 accident in Greenland, in which a B-52 crashed and burned and 4 hydrogen bombs were scattered across the ice, was managed through a combination of immediate classification and careful public messaging that emphasized the bombs had not detonated, without fully addressing the contamination and cleanup challenges that followed. The Soviet Union was, if anything, more systematic about suppressing information about accidents involving nuclear materials. The full extent of Soviet nuclear accidents became known only in the years following the dissolution of the Soviet state, and even then the picture remained incomplete. The practice of suppressing information about near misses was itself a form of safeguard, in the sense that public knowledge of how frequently the system came close to failure might have produced political pressures that the system could not absorb. But it was also a form of self-defeating management, because the suppression of information about failures prevented the full institutional learning that could have reduced the frequency of future failures. The people who knew about the accidents could learn from them. The people who did not know could not, and the circle of people who knew was deliberately kept as small as possible. The bureaucratic management of nuclear fear was one of the most distinctive features of the Cold War, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives. Both superpowers developed elaborate institutional structures for converting the existential anxiety of nuclear confrontation into administrative procedures. Civil defense programs in the United States produced pamphlets explaining how to survive a nuclear attack by taking cover under desks and inside basements. The programs were not fraudulent in the sense of being consciously dishonest. The people who designed them believed that survival was possible in certain scenarios, particularly for populations at some distance from the actual targets. But the programs also served a function that was not purely practical. By converting nuclear terror into a set of procedures, they made the terror manageable. They transformed the possibility of annihilation into a planning problem, and planning problems could be addressed by bureaucracies. The civil defense program was a safeguard against panic as much as it was a safeguard against nuclear effects, and in that sense it was one of the most successful components of the entire Cold War management apparatus. The Soviet civil defense program operated on an even larger scale, including the construction of enormous blast shelters in major cities, regular civil defense exercises involving large portions of the civilian population, and a public discourse that treated nuclear war as survivable through proper preparation. The Soviet program reflected the same fundamental logic as the American one, that the management of public response to nuclear danger was as important as the management of the nuclear forces themselves. A population that was in panic was a political problem that could constrain leadership options in ways that a population that had been given procedures could not. The civil defense programs were not about survival. They were about governance. They were about maintaining the fiction that the institutions of the state could manage the consequences of the thing they were also the primary agents in risking. The relationship between nuclear weapons policy and domestic politics was one of the most underappreciated complexities of the Cold War. On the American side, the nuclear budget was embedded in a political economy that involved defense contractors, congressional districts, research universities, and the entire military-industrial infrastructure that Eisenhower had famously warned about in his farewell address. The safeguards against nuclear war were also simultaneously a jobs program, a procurement system, a research funding mechanism, and a political coalition. The people who benefited economically from the existence of nuclear weapons were not, in most cases, people who wanted nuclear war. They were people who benefited from nuclear preparedness, which required continuous investment, which required a threat environment that justified the investment. The management of nuclear danger was inseparable from the management of the economic and political interests that surrounded it. On the Soviet side, the nuclear program was embedded in a different but equally complex set of institutional interests. The military-industrial complex of the Soviet Union, the defense sector that consumed an extraordinary share of Soviet economic output throughout the Cold War, had its own imperatives and its own forms of institutional self-preservation. Soviet military planners had interests in maintaining a threat environment that justified their budgets and their institutional authority. The men who ran the Soviet nuclear program were not plotting nuclear war. They were managing careers, institutions, and bureaucratic empires that required a certain level of threat to remain relevant. The recognition that institutional interests on both sides were deeply invested in the continuation of the nuclear confrontation does not imply that the Cold War was manufactured or fraudulent. The threat was real. The weapons were real. The capability for mutual annihilation was real. But the institutional structures that managed the threat were also deeply self-referential. They justified their own existence through the threat they were simultaneously perpetuating. The safeguards against nuclear war were maintained by institutions whose survival depended on the continued existence of nuclear danger. The machinery of protection and the machinery of threat were, in many cases, the same machinery. The final decade of the Cold War introduced a new set of technical realities that complicated the already precarious balance. The development of highly accurate, multiple, independently targetable re-entry vehicles, warheads that could be carried by a single missile and directed to separate targets, fundamentally changed the arithmetic of nuclear exchange. A single missile could now destroy multiple missiles in their silos. This meant that a first strike could, in theory, be conducted with a fraction of the attacker's arsenal while destroying a large fraction of the target's arsenal. The math of deterrence shifted. Instead of requiring an enormous first strike to have any effect, a relatively small and accurate first strike could potentially disarm enough of the opponent's retaliatory capability to make the risk-reward calculation of aggression more tempting. The response to this technical shift was a doctrine known as launch on warning, which held that nuclear forces would be launched as soon as an incoming attack was detected and before the incoming warheads actually arrived. Launch on warning was a safeguard against the disarming first strike. It was also a commitment to fire nuclear weapons based entirely on sensor data before any human being could verify whether the sensors were correct. The doctrine was never formally announced, but was acknowledged to be operational policy by American officials at various points. It meant that the decision to initiate nuclear war could, under certain conditions, be made in the time between a radar alert and the arrival of physical confirmation, a window measured in minutes. The Soviet equivalent of launch on warning was similarly operational, and the combination of both sides committed to firing on warning of an attack produced a system in which the primary risk was not the deliberate decision of either side to go to war, but the possibility that a false alarm on either side would trigger a real response before it could be corrected. The safeguard of assured retaliation had produced a hair trigger. The hair trigger was pointed in both directions simultaneously. Against this backdrop, the actions of individual human beings within the system become historically significant, not because they were heroic, but because the system itself had become so automated that human intervention was the only remaining source of correction. Petrov's refusal to report the false alarm was not authorized by his protocols. It was a violation of them. The Soviet naval officer Vasily Arkhipov, who in October 1962 was the flotilla commander aboard a Soviet submarine near Cuba, refused to approve the launch of a nuclear torpedo when the submarine's captain, believing that depth charges dropping around them indicated the beginning of a war, wanted to fire. Under Soviet procedures, the launch required the agreement of 3 senior officers aboard the submarine. The captain and the political officer agreed. Arkhipov did not. The torpedo was not launched. American ships had been conducting signaling exercises with conventional depth charges, unaware that the submarine below them had been tracking them for days, was nearly out of air, was too deep to communicate with Moscow, and had crew members who had concluded that the war they had been sent to deter had begun. The decision that prevented that moment from becoming a nuclear exchange was made by a single officer who had no communication with his superiors, no additional information beyond what he could observe from inside a submarine that was being shaken by underwater detonations, and no institutional framework that authorized him to refuse. These individual interventions were not part of any safeguard. They were, in the technical sense, failures of the system to function as designed. The system was designed to remove individual judgment from the loop, to replace it with procedures, protocols, and automated responses. The moments when individual judgment reasserted itself, when a single person decided to deviate from the procedure because the procedure would lead to catastrophe, were the moments when the system's fundamental design flaw became visible. The system had been built to function reliably in the absence of human wisdom. What it actually required at its most critical moments was exactly that. The Cold War produced an extraordinary proliferation of classified knowledge. The systems that have been described in this account were not secret from the people who operated them. They were secret from everyone else, which meant that the evaluation of whether the safeguards were working was itself performed by the same institutions that designed and operated the safeguards. There was no external audit. There was no independent verification. The people who knew the most about how close to failure the system had come were the people with the greatest institutional interest in managing public knowledge of those failures. The partial declassification of Cold War records that has occurred in the decades since the Soviet Union's dissolution has revealed some of what was hidden. It has also made clear that the most sensitive records, particularly those involving near misses and accidents, remain classified or have been partially destroyed. The history of the Cold War that can be written is the history of what has been released. The history of what actually happened includes an unknown quantity of events that remain sealed, unrecovered, or permanently lost. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 was interpreted in the West, and particularly in the United States, as a vindication of the safeguard strategy. Deterrence had worked. The Cold War had ended without nuclear exchange. The enormous investment in managed confrontation had produced the outcome it was designed to produce. This interpretation was not entirely wrong, but it was not entirely right either. What actually ended in 1991 was the political structure that had organized one side of the confrontation. The weapons did not disappear. The command systems did not dismantle themselves. The institutional knowledge embedded in both sides' military establishments did not evaporate. What changed was the political authority over those systems on the Soviet side, and the change was rapid, chaotic, and deeply uncertain in its implications for the safety of the weapons themselves. The years immediately following the Soviet dissolution were, by several measures, among the most dangerous in the entire history of nuclear weapons management. The former Soviet nuclear arsenal was distributed across newly independent states, some of which had no institutional capacity to manage it, no established command authority over it, and no clear political relationship with the new Russian state that was attempting to assert control over it. The chaos was managed imperfectly through a combination of American financial assistance for weapons consolidation, Russian military operations to secure weapons and fissile materials, and a series of agreements that transferred control of nuclear weapons from Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus to Russia in exchange for security assurances. The security assurances were provided through the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. They were not legally binding treaty commitments. They were political statements. Their subsequent history is not part of the Cold War period. It is part of what the Cold War produced when it ended. The safeguards that had been built over 40 years of managed confrontation were designed to prevent a war between two superpowers who understood each other's capabilities, had established channels of communication, and shared, at some level, a common interest in not destroying the world. When the political structure of one of those superpowers dissolved, the safeguards did not automatically adapt. They were institutions, and institutions survived the purposes they were built to serve. The hotline continued to operate. The nuclear command procedures continued to function. The early warning systems continued to scan the skies. What they were managing was no longer the same thing they had been built to manage, but they continued to manage it in the ways they had been designed. The machinery of the Cold War outlasted the Cold War. The systems built for the worst-case scenario remained operational after the scenario they were designed for had nominally passed. The weapons are still there. The procedures are still in place. The sensors are still scanning. The launch authority still exists. The worst-case scenario was managed for 4 decades through a combination of institutional design, individual courage, procedural accident, and what can only be described as extraordinary luck. And then the political context that defined it changed, and the systems built around it continued to function, waiting for conditions that might in some form return.